At the scholarship ceremony, my grandson leaned close enough that I could smell the nervous citrus of his cologne and whispered, "Stay out of sight." He didn't even look at me as he said it, just kept his eyes fixed straight ahead at the rows of polished chairs and the expectant audience, as if he were afraid that anyone might notice I was with him, as if my presence were some secret he needed to hide. I swallowed the words down like something bitter, too thick to spit out, too sharp to ignore, and I nodded because that is what I have done most of my life when people told me to take up less space, to lower my voice, to be grateful just for being allowed in the room. And yet, inside me, something trembled, not from frailty but from recognition, because I had heard variations of that same command for decades, from my husband when he didn't want his colleagues to see me in my thrift store dress, from my son when he didn't want me to tell stories about his childhood to his new friends, from the neighbors who smiled tightly whenever I lingered too long on their perfect driveways. Now, here it was again, distilled and sharpened, handed down like an inheritance of shame, resting on the lips of the boy I once rocked to sleep, the boy whose school forms I filled out in careful penmanship, the boy whose music lessons I paid for in secret installments while working overtime at the school office. I should tell you who I am, though I hardly know how to describe myself anymore. I am 78 years old, my hair long since surrendered to silver, my joints stiff in the morning, but still obedient enough to carry me where I need to go. I live alone in a small house on a quiet street where the lilacs lean against the windows in spring, and the leaves gather in damp piles come autumn. The walls of my house hold 1,000 echoes, children's laughter, arguments behind closed doors, the hiss of a kettle that once never cooled. But now the sound is mostly just the hum of the refrigerator and the shuffle of my own slippers across linoleum. I retired years ago from my position as a school secretary, though to call it a mere job feels unfair to the hours and the heart I poured into it. I was the first to arrive in the morning, unlocking doors before dawn, and the last to leave in the evening, typing out endless reports, soothing teachers and lending pencils to children who had no one at home to notice they had run out. The scholarship fund that carried my grandson onto that stage tonight was seeded, in part by the years of careful savings I encouraged, the fundraisers I organized, the late nights balancing numbers on ledgers no one else wanted to touch. I should have been invisible to the bureaucracy, just another aging woman with tidy handwriting, but in those files and balances, I carved out something lasting. So when the principal later said my name aloud, it was not charity, it was history. But at the start of that evening, before any speeches, before the lights dimmed, all I heard was the boy I loved telling me to hide. I wish I could tell you I was shocked, but the truth is that humiliation never arrives like lightning at my age. It arrives like rain, steady, familiar, always seeping through, even when you've patched the roof a dozen times before. I had packed carefully for that ceremony, laid out my best navy dress the night before, the one with the modest collar and the hem that fell just below the knees. I pressed it myself, smoothing every wrinkle with the heavy iron my daughter-in-law once called outdated. Though it works better than any of her sleek machines, I polished my shoes until I could see my face reflected faintly in the leather. I even dabbed a bit of rosewater behind my ears, though the bottle has been nearly empty for years, because I wanted to smell like the version of myself that still believed appearances mattered. I arrived early, walking slowly but steadily from the bus stop to the school auditorium, holding the invitation like a passport, as if it alone could prove my right to be there. And when I found my seat, I folded my hands neatly in my lap and tried to shrink into the background, telling myself that tonight was not about me. It was about him, about his hard work, about his future. Yet even then, before he spoke, a part of me hoped, quietly, secretly, that he might turn to me with pride, might introduce me to his friends, might acknowledge the hours we spent together practicing essays at my kitchen table, the weekends I sacrificed to sit through recitals where every note felt like a small victory. Instead, I was told to stay out of sight, and the words settled into me like stones dropped into deep water. Do you know what it feels like to become a ghost in a room you once built? I do. That auditorium had been my second home for 30 years. I had scrubbed its stage before talent shows, carried heavy boxes of programs for graduations, calmed crying children in its hallways. Yet when I stepped inside that night, not a single teacher recognized me, not a single student glanced twice. My grandson brushed past me quickly, his suit too new, his smile rehearsed, his eyes darting everywhere but toward mine. His parents stood near the front, nodding to acquaintances, shaking hands as if they were the benefactors rather than the beneficiaries. My daughter-in-law's dress shimmered under the lights, every inch of her calculated to draw admiration, and when she saw me hovering nearby, she smiled in that polite, tight way that means, "Please don't embarrass us." My son gave me a quick wave, the kind you give to a distant relative you bump into at the market, not the woman who once stayed up all night sewing his costume for the school play because he had forgotten to tell me until the last minute. And so I drifted backward toward the last row where the lights dimmed and the shadows stretched, and I sat down quietly as instructed. "Stay out of sight," he had said. I was learning, painfully, how easily they all wanted me erased. I sat there listening to the buzz of voices, the scrape of chairs, the faint rustle of programs. Around me, families leaned close, mothers adjusting ties, fathers snapping photographs, siblings whispering jokes. Every movement was filled with ownership, as though the children on that stage were the living trophies of their love. I clasped my hands tightly together to keep from trembling, and I told myself I didn't mind, that invisibility had become second nature. Yet I could not stop remembering all the small, invisible sacrifices that had carried him to this night. The piano, bought on credit and paid off slowly with my overtime hours, the tutoring sessions I arranged when his grades slipped, the groceries I quietly stocked in their cupboards when my son's job was uncertain, the essays I edited until midnight. I thought of the winter he had pneumonia when I slept upright in a chair beside his bed, changing cool cloths on his forehead while his parents fought in another room. He never knew all that, and perhaps he never needed to. But I knew. I carried it in my bones, in the wear of my body, in the fatigue that never fully left me. And as the lights dimmed and the ceremony began, I realized the cruelest truth of all. Love given in silence often becomes invisible not only to the world, but to the very people it was meant to save. When the moment finally came, it arrived not with drama or shouting, but with the soft cruelty of something planned, something rehearsed, the kind of exclusion that pretends to be polite. The rows of students were called one by one, names echoing through the auditorium, applause swelling and fading like waves. My grandson's name was called near the end, his suit catching the stage lights, his smile dazzling, his parents clapping with exaggerated pride from the front row. I clapped too, my palms stinging, though from where I sat in the back it must have looked like nothing at all. I waited for the acknowledgement, the tilt of his head toward me, the lift of his hand in recognition, but his gaze never once traveled in my direction. Instead, his eyes sought the principal, the dignitaries, the cameras set up to record the evening. And then came the moment when families were invited forward for photographs with the award recipients, and I hesitated, half rising from my seat, smoothing my skirt, preparing to walk toward the stage, until I saw my son turn sharply and catch my eye, with the kind of glance that contains a command. He shook his head almost imperceptibly, just once, and mouthed the words, "Stay there." It was the same message in a different form. Stay out of sight. Stay silent. Do not ruin the picture we are creating. My body froze, and I lowered myself back into the chair as though I had misjudged the strength of my legs, though the truth was that it was not my bones that failed me, but my family's willingness to see me. I sat there with my hands folded tightly, watching as they all gathered on the stage, a perfect tableau of success. The boy in his suit holding the certificate, his parents beaming at his side, the principal's hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Flashbulbs popped, capturing the moment forever, and I was not in a single frame. A stranger looking at those pictures years from now would believe the story they told, that his rise had been supported solely by the people standing proudly beside him, that his effort was recognized and applauded, that everything necessary was contained in that smiling trio. The truth of the unpaid bills, the after-school meals, the quiet tutoring, the nights I stayed awake worrying about his future, all of that would vanish, unwritten, undocumented, erased as though it had never existed. I knew in that instant that the ceremony was not just about celebrating his achievement, but about rewriting the story of how he arrived there, trimming out the inconvenient details, the untidy truths, and I was one of those truths. They wanted the narrative of a polished family, streamlined, presentable, untouched by the sight of an old woman whose hands bore the lines of labor, whose dress had been carefully mended more than once, whose presence might remind them that success is rarely clean, rarely simple, rarely without cost. When the photographs ended, they descended the stage, flushed with triumph, and my grandson passed me on his way to the reception hall. For a brief second, his eyes flickered toward me, and in that flicker, I searched for something. Guilt, affection, even acknowledgement. But what I found instead was a kind of irritation, as if he were bracing himself for an interruption, as if my very existence threatened to disrupt the story he wanted others to believe. He brushed past quickly, murmuring something to his mother, and she glanced back at me with that brittle smile that has no warmth, the one she uses when she wants to remind me of my place. My son avoided my gaze altogether, his hand resting lightly on his wife's back, as if the choreography of their family had no room for an extra figure. I remained seated, my body stiff, my mind moving through memories faster than I could contain them. I remembered the day I signed the check for his entrance exam, the way my son had promised to pay me back when he got his bonus, though of course that day never came. I remembered the Saturday morning spent at the kitchen table, guiding him through practice tests while the rest of the family slept. I remembered the birthday when he wanted nothing but a guitar, and I sold a bracelet my husband had given me decades earlier so I could surprise him, because the look on his face was worth more than any piece of jewelry. And yet here I was, an uninvited guest at the story of his success, told to wait quietly at the margins while others claimed the center. The cruelty of it was not loud, not violent, but it was deliberate, and that deliberateness stung more than any outburst ever could. To be forgotten is one kind of pain, but to be intentionally set aside, to be instructed not to exist too visibly, that is another entirely. It told me that my presence was not merely overlooked, but actively unwanted, that the history I shared with him was an inconvenience, that the love I poured into him was a debt, already written off as unworthy of acknowledgement. Sitting there in the back row, the applause still ringing in the air, I understood with startling clarity that this was not a momentary lapse or a misunderstanding. This was the shape of things now. I had been erased from the story, and the erasure was being applauded as progress, as tidiness, as the way forward. And in that moment, a part of me began to grow still, not the stillness of resignation, but the stillness that comes before a change, the gathering of strength in silence. Because while they believed I would accept invisibility forever, they had forgotten one simple truth. Even a shadow has weight, and even the quietest presence cannot be fully erased. The reception hall smelled faintly of sugared pastries and overbrewed coffee, the kind of scent that lingers in school corridors long after the children have gone home. But I hardly noticed it because I was too aware of my own position, standing off to the side as families swirled around me, their laughter high and bright, their cameras flashing, their bouquets of flowers resting proudly in the crook of their arms. I held my small purse in front of me like a shield, trying to remember why I had come, trying to convince myself that it was enough simply to witness my grandson's triumph, even if I was not allowed to belong to it. My chair had been left behind in the auditorium, so here I was, forced to stand, watching the way mothers posed beside their children, kissing them on the cheek, fathers clapping their sons on the back, siblings wrapping their arms around each other, in the awkward but unmistakable language of pride. And I, who had done the quiet work of holding my grandson's world together when it threatened to unravel, stood like an intruder at the edge of the crowd, smiling when no one was looking, nodding as if I had been included in conversations where I had not even been acknowledged. I tried to remind myself that it was just one evening, just one event, but every minute stretched like an indictment, every gesture reminding me that I was a figure to be managed rather than embraced. My daughter-in-law moved through the crowd like she was hosting a gala, her hand brushing the shoulders of acquaintances, her laugh tinkling at all the right places, her posture perfect in every photograph. Whenever her gaze caught mine, she tilted her head in that subtle way that said, "Stay back, don't interrupt, let the picture remain smooth." My son did not look at me at all, as though the act of seeing me would acknowledge something inconvenient, something too raw to fit the polished narrative they wanted to display. I thought of the years when I was the one bringing him to ceremonies, to school plays, to music recitals, when he was the one standing nervously in the corner, and I was the one pushing him gently forward, whispering encouragement, reminding him that he was worthy of being seen, how easily he had forgotten, or perhaps how deliberately he had chosen to forget, that it was I who had steadied his hands, I who had sewn his shirts, I who had made sure he never walked into a room feeling unprepared. And now he left me alone at the edge of a room, pretending I did not exist. The cruelty of the evening was not in a single action, but in the accumulation of small dismissals, each one minor enough to seem forgivable, yet together forming a wall that could not be breached. When the photographs were displayed on a screen at the far end of the hall, I saw my grandson's smile projected in large, bright color, his certificate held high, his parents standing proudly beside him. The audience applauded, and he basked in the glow, waving slightly, his cheeks flushed with triumph. But as the images cycled through, I realized with a slow ache that I would not appear once. No one had taken my picture. No one had captured me even at the margins of the frame. I was present but absent, a ghost whose body took up space without leaving a trace. And in that realization lay a deeper wound than the whispered words at the start of the evening, because now the erasure was complete. Not only had I been told to hide, but the world would never know I had even been there. I watched other grandmothers fussing over their grandchildren, straightening collars, offering tissues, holding coats. They moved freely, welcomed into the orbit of their families, their presence assumed, unquestioned, taken for granted in the most tender way. I envied them, though not with bitterness, but with a sorrow so deep it felt like a physical weight in my chest. I wondered if those women ever knew what it was to be unwanted, to be tolerated only on the condition of silence. I wondered if they had ever heard words like "stay out of sight" from the mouths of those they had raised. I wondered if they could imagine what it felt like to have invested not just money, but pieces of one's own body and spirit, only to be erased from the final portrait. And as I watched them, I felt the shape of my own invisibility more sharply, as though I had been outlined in chalk against the floor of that hall. The evening dragged on, each announcement, each toast, each polite laugh from my daughter-in-law cutting a little deeper. At one point, when my legs grew tired, I tried to sit at an empty table near the back, but a group of parents arrived and filled the seats around me without acknowledgement, their conversation flowing over me as if I were furniture. I sat there for a while, sipping at a cup of lukewarm coffee, listening to their talk of summer plans and college applications, until finally one of them glanced at me and smiled politely, the kind of smile you give a stranger who has wandered into the wrong room. I nodded in return, pretending not to notice that they lowered their voices afterward, closing me out even from casual chatter. I rose slowly, returned to the edges, and resumed my place in silence. What unsettled me most was how natural it seemed to them, how seamless the choreography of exclusion had become. No one had to conspire or plan, no one had to raise their voice. My grandson did not need to repeat his command. My son did not need to push me away physically. The absence was performed so efficiently, so instinctively, that it felt like a dance they had practiced many times before. I realized then that this evening was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of small decisions, small silences, small steps taken away from me until I had been left standing alone at the margins. I had been erased not suddenly, but gradually, and the ceremony was simply the stage where the erasure became visible even to me. I thought of the hours I had spent preparing for this evening, the way I had ironed my dress, polished my shoes, chosen earrings that would not draw too much attention, but still sparkle faintly in the light. I had told myself that my effort mattered, that showing respect for the occasion was a way of honoring him. But standing there, I realized that nothing I wore, nothing I did, nothing I offered could alter the truth that they did not want me to be seen. My presence was a flaw in their picture, and they had learned how to crop me out without even touching the frame. And so the night lengthened. The speeches droned on, the laughter grew louder, and I became quieter and smaller until I felt myself folding inward, retreating to some hidden place where at least the sting could not reach me so sharply. Yet even in that silence, something stirred, a flicker of refusal that I could not quite extinguish. It was not anger exactly, though anger hummed at the edges, but rather a deep awareness that I could not allow this to become the final shape of my life. If they wished me invisible, I would have to decide for myself whether to vanish. And though I did not yet know what form it would take, I felt in the marrow of my bones that the answer would not be silence forever. I had given too much, loved too fiercely, and endured too long to let my story end at the back of a hall, clutching a purse and sipping cold coffee while my grandson smiled into cameras that would never remember me. I did not expect the shift to come from anyone in that room, least of all from the man who had once signed my paychecks and who had probably forgotten the number of times I had stayed late to balance his reports. Yet when the principal stepped forward to the microphone and began his closing remarks, the first words he spoke were my name. It took me a moment to recognize it because I had not heard it spoken aloud in that hall in so many years. And when the sound carried across the reception, it felt both foreign and familiar, like a melody I used to hum without realizing. He thanked me in front of everyone, his voice steady, clear, and certain. And for a breathless moment, the room turned, faces shifting toward me, smiles softening, eyes acknowledging that I existed. He spoke not of my family or my grandson, but of my years of service to the school, of the countless hours spent organizing scholarships, of the patience with which I had guided children who arrived at the office in tears, of the precision that kept records intact long before computers shouldered the burden. He said that much of the scholarship fund that had made this ceremony possible was rooted in the work I had done decades earlier, that the children receiving recognition tonight were, in some quiet way, beneficiaries of my labor. The applause that followed was not thunderous, not the wild cheering reserved for the young achievers on the stage, but it was steady and sincere, and in that sound I felt something loosen in my chest. For a fleeting moment I was not invisible. I stood where I was, my purse clutched in front of me, my back suddenly straighter, my breath deeper, as if a weight had been shifted even slightly. My grandson's face flushed, though not with pride. No, his expression was tight, embarrassed, as if my acknowledgement had stolen a corner of his spotlight. My daughter-in-law whispered quickly in his ear, her lips pressed into a thin smile, her eyes darting toward me with irritation. But the damage, or perhaps the salvation, had already been done. My name had been spoken into the air of that hall, carried into ears that would not easily forget it. And for once, I was not simply the shadow behind someone else's story. As the applause faded, I thought of all the times I had worked late at my desk, the lamp casting a yellow pool of light over stacks of papers, my fingers cramped from typing, my eyes stinging from the strain. No one had applauded me then. No one had thanked me, not even my own family who benefited from the steady paycheck and the insurance that covered their colds and fevers. Those years were marked by invisibility. Yet now, unexpectedly, a single acknowledgement illuminated them in retrospect, making them visible again, not just to others, but to me. I realized that part of the cruelty of invisibility is that it seeps into your own sense of self until you begin to forget your own contributions, your own worth, your own name. And in that moment, hearing my name called, I felt the faint outline of myself reappear, the contours of a woman who had built something with her hands and her diligence, a woman who had mattered. I did not smile broadly or wave my hand. I did not rise from my seat to bask in the recognition. Instead, I allowed myself a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that I had been seen, and I let the warmth of it spread slowly through me. I saw other families glance at me differently now, some nodding in respect, others whispering softly. It was not a grand transformation, not the restoration of all that had been taken from me, but it was enough to shift something within. My grandson's eyes avoided mine. My son's jaw tightened. My daughter-in-law busied herself with a program she had already read 3 times, but none of their discomfort could erase what had been spoken into that microphone. For the first time all evening, I did not feel ashamed of standing where I stood. I felt entitled to the space I occupied, entitled to breathe the same air, entitled to hold my head at a height that did not beg permission. The evening continued, speeches closing, people rising from their chairs, the murmur of conversation swelling again. But I remained in that stillness for as long as I could. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a shift, a reminder that no one could fully erase me if I did not cooperate. They could whisper at me to stay hidden, they could frown at me from across the room, but they could not take away what I had given. They could not silence a history that had been witnessed by others. They could not erase the echo of my name once it had been spoken aloud. And though my family might never willingly give me the recognition I deserved, I understood in that moment that recognition does not always come from where you expect it, that sometimes it arrives from strangers or from the very institution that once overlooked you, and that sometimes it arrives late, but still in time to remind you who you are. I walked out of the hall that night not taller, not triumphant, but steadier, with the faintest sense that I had begun to reclaim something that had been slipping away from me for too many years. The words "stay out of sight" no longer felt like chains but like echoes, fading even as I took each step. And though I knew the silence and erasure would return, though I knew there were still confrontations and humiliations ahead, I also knew something had shifted. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of defiance taking root inside me. Quiet but firm, like a seed long buried, finally remembering it could grow. The shift that came with the principal's words should have been enough to carry me through the rest of the evening, but families like mine have a way of tightening the noose the moment they feel their control slipping. And so what followed was not relief or reconciliation, but a sharpened pressure, an escalation disguised as concern, yet dripping with the same quiet cruelty that had defined the earlier hours. As people gathered coats and posed for final photographs, I lingered by the exit, my body tired but my mind awake with the faint warmth of having been seen. And it was there that my grandson approached me, his eyes darting left and right to make sure. No one else was listening before he leaned close again. This time his whisper was harsher, edged with a resentment that surprised me, as though my brief acknowledgement had wounded him somehow. "Why did you have to let him mention you?" he hissed, his jaw tight, his lips barely moving. "You made it about yourself. This was supposed to be my night." I looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the little boy who used to climb onto my lap with sticky fingers and soft hair, but a young man already learning the language of erasure, already fluent in the family, script that treated my presence as an inconvenience, already rehearsing the lines that had been modeled by his parents. I wanted to tell him that I had not asked for the recognition, that the principal had chosen to speak my name of his own accord, that I had not raised my hand or demanded a moment in the spotlight, but I knew from the tightness in his expression that he would not hear me. He had been told his story belonged to him alone, that his achievements were the product of his own effort and the guidance of the polished parents who now hovered behind him, and he could not afford to let my existence complicate that picture. Before I could respond, his mother was there, her hand on his shoulder, her smile fixed and brittle. "She means well," she said, her voice pitched in that falsely sweet tone reserved for children and elderly relatives. "But sometimes she forgets that it isn't about her. Don't take it personally, darling." Then she turned her gaze to me, her smile still plastered in place, but her eyes cold and sharp. "It would have been kinder to just let him shine," she added, as though kindness were measured by how thoroughly I erased myself. My son joined them then, his expression tense, his words clipped. "Mom, we talked about this," he said. "You're here to support, not to be part of the ceremony. You've got to understand the difference." The three of them stood before me like a wall, their unity unbroken, their narrative already agreed upon. And in that moment, I felt smaller than I had in years, smaller even than when I sat alone in the back row of the auditorium. To be told by one's own child that one's role is merely to support without being seen is a wound sharper than any stranger's insult. I remembered the nights I sat at the kitchen table with him when he was a boy, guiding him through homework he had thrown his hands up at, soothing his frustration, telling him he was capable when he wanted to give up. Did that not count as being part of the ceremony? Did decades of sacrifices and choices and labors not earn me even a shadow of acknowledgement? But the faces before me were unmoved, rehearsed in their dismissal, and I realized with a clarity that stunned me that I was not only invisible, but now framed as selfish for daring to exist visibly. It was not enough that I be quiet, I also had to accept blame if my silence was ever broken, even by someone else. I left the building without speaking further, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap, and walked slowly down the darkened street toward the bus stop. The sound of laughter trailed after me, families spilling into cars, children chattering about their futures, bouquets rustling in the arms of proud parents, and I walked alone, my coat thin against the chill. At the stop, I sat heavily on the metal bench, the hard surface biting into my bones, and stared at the streetlights glowing against the darkness. I told myself it was only one evening, but I knew better. It was the unveiling of what had been simmering beneath the surface for years, the confirmation of a truth I had tried not to name. I was no longer part of their story, and every attempt I made to remain visible would be met not with gratitude, but with irritation, resentment, or outright rejection. In the days that followed, the escalation continued in subtler forms. My son called once, his voice clipped, telling me that it might be better if I did not attend the celebration dinner they were planning for my grandson, as the restaurant was a little too upscale, and he did not want me to feel uncomfortable. I knew what he meant. He did not want me to embarrass him, did not want me to sit at the table in my carefully pressed but modest dress, did not want the waitstaff to see an old woman who did not fit the image of effortless prosperity he wanted to. Project. My daughter-in-law sent me a message thanking me for coming to the ceremony, but advising that next time it would be best to let the kids take center stage without distractions. Distractions. That was the word she used, as though my existence were a glitch in the program, a flicker of static across their polished broadcast. My grandson did not call at all, did not write, did not stop by as he once had to raid my cookie tin or to ask for help with an essay. The silence was not surprising, but it was heavy. I tried to tell myself I could endure it, that I had endured worse in my life, but endurance is not the same as living. Each dismissal was a quiet tightening of the rope, each silence a confirmation that the erasure was not a mistake, but a deliberate act of self-protection on their part. They wanted to rise, to be admired, to be seen as a family polished and complete, and in order to achieve that, I had to be removed. My age, my modest clothes, my history of work rather than wealth, these were stains on the picture they wanted to frame, and so I was to be cropped out. The realization pressed on me like a weight, not because I had not suspected it, but because they no longer even bothered to disguise it as anything else. The ceremony had shown me that they were comfortable with my invisibility, and now they expected me to cooperate fully with my own erasure. One afternoon, while sorting through old papers at my kitchen table, I came across the receipts for the piano lessons I had paid for over the years, folded neatly into an envelope I had labeled music. Each line item carried not just the amount, but the memory of the sacrifice that made it possible, the extra shift at the school, the pair of shoes I did not buy for myself, the dinner I simplified so the money could stretch. I ran my fingers over the faded ink and thought of how easily those sacrifices had been absorbed into the background, how little they mattered now to the boy who once sat beside me practicing scales until his small hands ached. I thought of the coat I had mended twice for my son when he was young, of the savings I had emptied to cover a medical bill, of the endless ways I had made myself smaller so they could step forward. And I realized that erasure had always been part of the pattern, only now it had become explicit. Still, even as the pain thickened, I felt the stirrings of something else. The principal's words, faint as they had been, lingered like a light at the edge of memory, reminding me that not everyone agreed to the story my family wanted to tell. Others had seen me. Others had remembered. Others had spoken my name aloud. That truth gnawed at the silence, pushing against the wall of dismissal, reminding me that while my family might want me invisible, the world did not fully cooperate. It was a small defiance, but it was enough to keep me from collapsing entirely. I began to walk differently, to hold my head differently, even as the pressure from my family mounted. And though I did not yet know what form my defiance would take, I knew with certainty that I could not allow their escalation to become my silence. For if they insisted on cropping me out of the picture, then I would have to find another frame, one where my presence was not only visible, but undeniable. The moment of decision did not arrive with thunder or with some carefully orchestrated plan. It arrived quietly, like most of the turning points in my life, disguised as something ordinary until I realized its weight. It was during the scholarship banquet a week later, a dinner arranged in a hotel ballroom, where my son had once again hinted that perhaps it would be best if I stayed home to rest. His words were coded in politeness, concern for my health, as though I were too frail to sit at a table and eat a meal, but I knew the truth well enough. He wanted me absent, invisible, erased from the photographs, excised from the polished image they wished to present to friends and acquaintances. I listened, nodding as though I might agree, but inside me something hardened, a stone settling into place. I ironed my dress, polished my shoes, and went anyway. The ballroom was a hive of noise, silverware clinking against plates, laughter bouncing off mirrored walls, the hum of conversation swelling beneath the glow of chandeliers. Families gathered at round tables draped in white linen, glasses raised, toasts offered. I saw my son's face tighten the moment I entered, my daughter-in-law's eyes flickering with irritation as she whispered something to the couple beside her. My grandson looked at me with a mixture of embarrassment and resentment, his jaw clenched, his shoulders stiff beneath his suit. But I did not shrink this time. I walked steadily to the registration table, gave my name, and accepted the small card that directed me to a seat. I did not ask where my family was sitting. I did not beg to be included at their table. I followed the card's instruction and found my place at a table near the front, reserved for past faculty and benefactors. It was there, to my astonishment, that I found myself beside the principal once again, as well as a few other familiar faces from the years I had worked at the school. They welcomed me warmly, asked after my health, and spoke of old days in the office, the endless paperwork, the children who had grown into adults now scattered across the country. Their words were simple, casual even, but to me they were a lifeline, proof that I had not been erased from every narrative. I laughed quietly at an old story, felt my shoulders ease, and for the first time in a long time, I belonged. When the awards began, I braced myself for the same routine. Names called, applause, families rushing to the stage. My grandson's name was announced again, his scholarship recognized a second time, and he stepped proudly into the spotlight. His parents rose to join him, smiling wide for the cameras. I remained seated, calm, watching. Then, unexpectedly, the principal called my name once more, inviting me to stand alongside them as one of the honored guests who had contributed to the establishment of the scholarship fund. The room stirred, heads turned, people clapped. My family froze. My grandson looked horrified, my son startled, my daughter-in-law stiff with rage. For a heartbeat I considered declining, waving it off, allowing their discomfort to dictate my place once again. But then I thought of all the years I'd been told to stay quiet, of every whispered instruction to move aside, of every photograph where my absence was treated as natural. I rose from my chair. The walk to the stage was not fast, my knees ached and my steps were careful, but it felt like a procession nonetheless, each step a declaration that I was not invisible, not disposable, not an afterthought. I climbed the short set of stairs and joined them under the lights. The cameras flashed, a wave of brightness that made me blink, but I did not falter. I stood tall beside my grandson, my hand resting lightly on his arm, not as a claim, but as a reminder. He stiffened at my touch, but I did not release him. The principal smiled, the audience applauded again, and for once, the picture could not exclude me. My face, lined and weathered though it was, would be captured in those photographs forever. They would not be able to crop me out, not this time. The photographer asked for one more shot, and my grandson forced a smile. My son's arm pressed firmly around his wife, their discomfort barely hidden behind their polished expressions. I smiled too, not with triumph or malice, but with something steadier, a deep, quiet satisfaction. I had reclaimed my place not with a speech, not with accusations, but with presence, with the refusal to disappear. The moment was irreversible. The image would remain long after the evening ended, proof that I had been there, that I had mattered, that their story could not be written without me. As I stepped down from the stage, I heard whispers ripple through the crowd, some recognizing my years of service, others remarking on the dignity with which I carried myself. I returned to my seat, my heart steady, my breathing calm. My family did not approach me for the rest of the evening. They spoke with others, laughed too loudly, pretended I was not there, but it no longer mattered. I had taken back something they could never steal again. I had shown them, and myself, that erasure is not inevitable, that even silence can be broken with a single step toward the light. When the banquet ended and the crowd spilled out into the night, I walked alone toward the bus stop, the cool air sharp against my cheeks. I thought of all the years I had diminished myself to fit their needs, all the times I had sat quietly in the background so they could shine without interruption, all the times I had swallowed the ache of being unseen. Tonight, for the first time, I had done the opposite. I had taken up space, not with noise or complaint, but simply with my body, my presence, my refusal to leave. It was not revenge, not even rebellion. It was reclamation. And as the bus rumbled toward home, I sat with my program folded neatly in my lap and felt, perhaps, for the first time in decades, that I had honored myself. When I returned home that night, the quiet of my small house wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, but for once it did not feel suffocating. It felt steady, like the silence of a chapel after the candles have burned low. I set my purse on the table, removed my coat carefully, and smoothed the creases from my dress with the same hands that had ironed it the night before. On the table, I placed the folded program from the banquet, not tucked away in a drawer as evidence to be hidden, not thrown aside as something meaningless, but laid out plainly where I could see it every time I passed. It was not proof for the world, not something I intended to show to anyone else, but a small reminder to myself that I had stood there, that I had been acknowledged, that I had chosen presence over absence. For years I had kept such tokens locked away, afraid they would be seen as prideful or inappropriate. But that night I understood that pride is not a sin when it is the only shield against erasure. I sat at my kitchen table, the one where my grandson had once done his homework, the one where I had stayed up late to balance accounts, and I allowed myself to breathe deeply. The ache of the evening lingered, the sting of my family's words still sharp, but underneath it was something calmer, something I had not felt in years. It was not happiness, not triumph, but a quiet dignity, a certainty that I had reclaimed a piece of myself. I knew my son and his wife would not forgive me for what they saw as intrusion. I knew my grandson would carry resentment rather than gratitude, but those things no longer had the power to unmake me. Their disapproval could not erase the photographs now printed and stored. Their silence could not erase the memory of the applause that had followed my name. What they wanted most was for me to doubt my own worth, to accept invisibility as the natural order, and I had refused. That refusal, simple as it was, felt like a revolution. As the night deepened, I thought of other women like me who had given quietly, who had sacrificed in ways unseen, who had been told to move aside when the moment of recognition arrived. I thought of the mothers who worked 2 jobs to buy school uniforms, the grandmothers who babysat without thanks so their children could climb careers, the widows who stretched every coin to make sure no child went hungry. I thought of all the ways women like us become invisible, not because we lack stories, but because our stories are inconvenient to those who wish to believe in their own self-sufficiency. And I thought of what I would say to them if they were sitting across the table from me now. I would not tell them to fight or to shout or to demand, though sometimes those things are necessary. I would tell them what I had just learned for myself, that invisibility only becomes permanent if you agree to it, that sometimes standing still in the light is enough, that sometimes the quiet act of refusing to move aside can change the shape of a life. I went to bed that night without bitterness. My family's betrayal remained. The wound was real, but it no longer defined the entirety of me. I had begun to understand that my value was not something they could grant or revoke. I lay under my quilt, the house still around me, and I felt the rhythm of my own breathing steady and alive. I thought of the faces in the crowd who had clapped for me, of the whispers that carried my name, of the photographs that would now always include me. And I whispered to myself, as though speaking to the younger version of me who had spent so many years bowing her head, "You are not erased." In the morning, The sun spilled across my table, catching on the program I had left there. I touched it lightly with my fingertips and smiled, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was proof that even small gestures can matter, that even quiet steps can alter the course of a story. And as I poured my tea, I thought again of the women who might someday hear my words. To the one sitting alone in the back row, told to stay out of sight, I would say this: stand when your name is called. Let the light touch you. Do not shrink away. You have given too much, carried too many burdens, to allow yourself to vanish when the world finally remembers you. Presence is not arrogance. It is survival, and you, like me, have earned your place.